Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me okay? Great. We're very lucky this morning to have Dipo Faloyin with us. Thank you. Dipo is a senior editor and writer at Vice magazine and a frequent contributor to other top publications, including The Guardian, Esquire, Newsweek, and Prospect. Dipo's writing focuses on race, culture, and identity across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Today, Dipo and I are going to discuss his new critically acclaimed book, Africa is Not a Country. Dipo will be signing copies afterwards. And this is a portrait of modern Africa that debunks persistent stereotypes in favor of telling a more complex and complete story. Welcome, Dipo.
Thank you so much.
So we've got a lot to get through this morning, 54 countries, 2,000 languages, 1.4 billion people, 45 minutes. Our topics will range from crazy dictators and rock stars to looted treasure and the horror of lemon wedges in Jollof rice. So forgive me if I hustle you along like Willy Wonka from one room of tasty treats to the next. Dipo, you were brought up in Nigeria and you wrote, Lagos is the punchline to a joke that could start 21 million people unburdened by self-doubt walk into a bar. Perhaps you could give us a taste from where you're from. And I'm going to ask Dipo to read from his book because it's so beautifully written. Thank you.
Identities formed specifically. I come from a place that exists somewhere between a pot of jollof rice and the busiest kitchen in West Africa, and a living room full of revolving main characters. I delight in discussion because I'm forged by my family's most consistent ritual, gathering too many people in a confined space and arguing about nothing, each person giving their opinion on each person's opinion. I was born to people with conflicting recollections of events where they were both present. I grew up surrounded by family forever complaining that someone else is not telling the story right, either in accuracy or with the requisite flair. In our home, history isn't written by the winner, but by whoever speaks first.
Thank you, Dipo. So this is really a book about storytelling and the importance of telling different stories, complex stories, and the stories that perhaps for too long the West has told itself about Africa are very different from the stories that Africans themselves tell about their own history. So this is what we're here today to discuss. And we're going to dive straight in with dictators. One of the stereotypes of Africa is the bloodthirsty dictator. You think of films like The Last King of Scotland, Blood Diamonds. You put it here. One of the most common tropes in popular culture is the violent African dictator slashing through the jungle with a machete, searching for villages to pillage, children to abduct, and blood diamonds to harvest. The narrative suggests there is something fundamentally ungovernable about this place and its people. But the thing is, there is some truth to the stereotype. I mean, we've had Idi Amin, Gaddafi, Mugabe. Why have there been so many dictators? Can you explain?
So it comes back to the fundamental foundation of each country and how each country was created. And one of the most important things to remember when we talk about Africa is that as we know these countries today, these countries did not exist before colonialism. They were invented. And in many cases, they were largely invented to fail. So for example, Nigeria is a country of around 200 million people and over 500 languages. And you'd ask yourself, well, why would one country have so many languages? And that was by design. What the British wanted was that they wanted to create countries that were incredibly large with a multitude of ethnic groups that spoke lots of different languages because it would be far harder for these different ethnic groups to work together to fight off the colonialists. So it was by design that there would be this constant swirl of confusion and strife between these ethnic groups. And in the case of many of these regions, they at the same time implemented another policy called divide and rule. And so in sort of regions in which the colonialists didn't want to settle themselves, what they would do was that they would empower the worst amongst us. They would find the most unscrupulous characters, people who were slick to a bribe, people with very low morals. And they would empower them. They would give them money, they would give them guns, they would invent titles that never existed before, and they would put them in charge. And they would say to them, if you want to continue having money and guns and all these nice things that we give you, then we'd like you to cause a bit of confusion amongst yourselves. We'd like you to spread misinformation about other ethnic groups and sow distrust between ethnic groups. And that's largely what happened for decades and decades. And they did this across the country. They'd find multitude of people in different ethnic groups to do that work for them. And what you often had at independence was you had a situation in which the colonialists then left, so we're in the 1960s now, but these individuals who we often refer to colloquially as big men, they stayed. They were from the countries, and so suddenly the worst amongst us were the ones who had the most wealth and the most power. And the work of shifting them has been a long process. It's not that the majority of African countries don't appreciate the value of democracy or they don't understand the importance of one man, one vote. It's just that we've had to, in the past 60 years, and remember it's just been 60 years, had to reevaluate and shift the country as far as possible away from the remnants of that divide and rule policy to something that we can now manage. And that work has been, in many cases, it's been difficult. It's been long. It's led to civil wars in some cases. But that work has largely been done without a lot of African countries getting the credit. Less than 10% of the continent is under authoritarian rule today, which is something that a lot of people don't appreciate.
Wow, less than 10%.
Less than 10%. And so when most people think about Africa and they think about African democracies and African leaders, they think, oh, they're all, strong men in military garb roaming around. But that's not the case. Prior to colonialism, these men and these systems of dictatorships didn't exist. It was something that was deliberately introduced during colonialism to make it easier for the colonialists to govern these countries, especially in regions that the colonialists themselves didn't want to live in because, malaria and they didn't quite like the weather. So those were the challenges that many African countries faced. But often people don't know that bit of the story. They don't understand the context that existed at independence and what these countries faced at the time. So instead, that stereotype of, when people think about Africa, they think, what is wrong with them when it comes to democracy and politics? But in fact, that's not the case at all.
So when Nigeria, your homeland, became independent, the legacy of colonialism there was a terrible civil war, wasn't it?
Yeah. So straight after, you had these big men in each region who wanted to fight for power. They felt they for decades and decades had been pitted against each other. They didn't understand all these other ethnic groups, and in these incredibly big countries, suddenly you had capital cities that were far away from where their people lived, and suddenly the only commodity was power. And that created this just whirlwind of mistrust and frustration and anger. And many of these nations in those early days, with a lot of these competing big men who'd been empowered to cause chaos in specific regions, suddenly they wanted to be the ultimate big man, the ultimate president, and the ultimate leader. And that led to, coup after coup in those early days, eventually civil wars. And in the time since then, it's been about trying to find a sense of peace and understanding within these nations. And it's been difficult work, but so many countries have done that work and don't necessarily receive the credit that they deserve for the work of building these nations. These are incredibly young countries. And so it's incredibly important that we add that context in so that it makes it easier to shift back from all the stereotypes that continue to be spread.
Talking of titles, I remember hitchhiking through Malawi in 1987, a long time ago, and the Kamuzu Banda had just given himself the new title of His Excellency, the Life President, which made us all chuckle because the acronym spelt HELP, which was an oversight on his chief of staff, probably. But so after independence, these countries, these brand new independent countries, having inherited a history that you've discussed, were then plunged into the Cold War. So then it wasn't like the external intervention ended with independence, did it? Tell us how that affected Ethiopia, Somalia, for example.
So you had, in a number of cases, a nation that was trying their hardest to rid themselves of these big men. The Nigerian singer Fela Kuti, his entire discography is about these big men and pushing back against them. And you saw the same thing in so many different countries. But one of the things that made it incredibly hard to fight off these big men was that they were still being financed. And we saw that during the Cold War, where their influence and their love was certainly for sale, and they were willing to sell it to the highest bidder. And both the United States and Russia were willing to pay. And so you had situations in which incredibly corrupt men who were on the precipice of being removed from power would simply go to one of the Soviet Union or to the US and say, look, the Soviet Union have been on the phone. They'd like my allegiance. What do you have for me? And the US, in the book, I kind of go into the detail of many of these conversations, would say, what do you want? And obviously, to stay in power, you often need arms. And so they would suddenly be rearmed, and they would be given all this wealth. And that kept them in place. It made it incredibly hard for communities across the continent to push these men out of power. And so these are some of the dynamics at play when it comes to the continued existence throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s into the 90s of these authoritarians. But with time, it's been easier to, and as we see and as I write about the book, the work that so many, especially youth-led movements, have done to try and shift their countries away from that has been serious. It's been extensive. But you can just imagine how difficult that is when so many institutional forces around the world have worked to keep these individuals in power for so long, despite the wants of the local population and the work they had to do. So the Cold War really sort of re-energized what was the sort of policy of the colonial era of empowering the most unscrupulous amongst us to stay in power. And that was sort of you have independence as sort of 2 steps forward, then suddenly you have the Cold War and it's 10 steps back. And so you're fighting these same battles again and again.
But there are some success stories, aren't there? I'm thinking of Rwanda, which for a lot of us probably conjures up images of the horrific genocide in 1994, when nearly 1 million Tutsis lost their lives. And a remarkable man called Paul Kagame ended the slaughter. He was an ethnic Tutsi and marched out of Uganda to finish it. And you talk at some length about him, and he's really interesting character. So I thought I'd just read you a short passage of an alternative strongman. 6'3" and wiry thin, Rwanda's president, Paul Kagame, looks like he should be leaning over a bright white dentist chair while gently explaining the merits of flossing to you. His frame is that of a person whose chances you would fear in a fight against a sudden gust of wind. Kagame exudes the energy of a band's backup tambourine player or of a person who carefully reads the terms and conditions before purchasing a candle. So how did such a gentle guy make such a success of Rwanda? Talk us through it.
It's a really interesting case. And in the book, I talk about the complexity of the nations that were inherited by Africans across the region. And so for Paul Kagame, he grew up in a refugee camp just outside of Rwanda. He was an ethnic Tutsi. Tutsis, about 1 million of them were killed in the genocide in the space of about 100 days. And eventually when he regained, and the Tutsis regained power, you can imagine that vengeance would have been the first thing on their minds. But he chose a different path. He decided that, looking around at a lot of other African countries, the biggest challenge that they face by their makeup is having all these different ethnic groups and people not identifying themselves as part of their nation, but instead as part of their ethnic group. Now, this as a fundamental dynamic is understandable. These countries were not designed by Africans on the ground. They were forced upon them, and they didn't feel, by the 1960s, sure, you've gained independence, but you don't feel necessarily a real patriotism towards this nation that was created against your will. And so that has been one of the challenges that many African countries have faced. And that sense of patriotism obviously takes time. You need to introduce a sense of, you have to go through the sort of the mechanics of nation building, things like creating a national anthem and national dress and what's our national language going to be like and what are our traditions and as this new invented nation. And that takes time. And Paul Kagame decided that would probably take too much time. So instead, he decided that he would simply outlaw the idea of you identifying first as your ethnic group. And instead, you must essentially identify as a Rwandan first and foremost. You shouldn't go around trying to build your ethnic group above other ethnic groups. Obviously, the tension of the genocide was understandably still there. And what that involved was making lots of very difficult decisions, such as releasing a lot of Hutus who were part of the genocide and organizing the genocide, and them being reintegrated into society, and trying to do it in a way that there wasn't a region just for the Tutsis and a region just for the Hutus. This is an incredibly difficult thing, as you can imagine, having to be forced to live with people who were responsible for the brutal murder of your community and your family and your friends. And so that was his way of addressing that fundamental problem. It's not necessarily, and in the book I kind of talk about the complexities of that model. It's not an easy thing to do, but that allowed Rwanda in the short term to sort of escape the regional civil war crises that bogged down so many countries and instead focus on their economic development, which has been incredible over the last few decades.
Well, averaged 8% over 20 years, haven't they?
Yeah.
Top 40 countries in the world to do business in or something. I mean, it seems unimaginable.
Time and time again. And he has also done that by firmly fixing himself in this position, saying, look, not only are we going to avoid essentially the constant sort of tussles across ethnic group for power, but he sort of instilled himself as sort of the one who was going to deal with that. And that obviously comes with its own complexities in a human's ability to handle ultimate power himself. But these are when we talk about these countries, there's not one right or wrong way of doing it necessarily. We've had a very short time to try and find a model and make that work for each individual country in a way that works for them. And so in Rwanda's case, that too comes with complexities around, how long is Paul Kagame going to insist on staying in power? What certain lengths is he taking to remain in power? At the same time as there's this great economic development, as well as being able to avoid a lot of the strife and death that would have come if the Tutsis decided to seek vengeance against the Hutus. So there is this kind of swirling, all these sort of decisions that each individual country needs to make. But the case of Kagame in Rwanda is a particularly interesting case study when it comes to simply just the challenges that so many African countries have to face when it comes to setting themselves up for the future and deciding what is the path forward. We've inherited these countries. They were not by design. They were, in many cases, built to essentially fail. We have all these men in power. We have all these different ethnic groups and languages. How do we come to some sort of common consensus? And
Kagame is interesting, isn't he? Because Rwanda's been called the Singapore of Africa, if you like. And there's a wonderful passage that you wrap up this section with about him meeting a Holocaust survivor. I wondered if you could just read that for us as well, because it's very powerful and it sort of raises questions around whether political freedom is limited in Rwanda, but maybe it's a price worth paying for peace and prosperity.
The president himself might have described the complex relationship between power and peace despotism in progress that signifies his complicated tenure. In a lengthy New Yorker profile, Kagame tells a story of the time he spoke to a young man who had been slashed with a machete and left for dead in one of the mass graves that littered Rwanda during the genocide. Miraculously, the boy survived. Years later, as part of the country's peace and reconciliation program, President Kagame ordered the release of some of the extremists who had orchestrated the mass killing, a few of whom were now living in that young man's village. All these years later, Kagame wanted to know how the man was coping with living just a few feet away from the people who tried to murder him and everyone he loved. And I asked him, how do you manage? Kagame recollects in the interview. When you meet them, what do they tell you? Or what do you tell them? What is your feeling? I want you to genuinely tell me how you feel. The young man looked at his president and replied, I manage because you ask us to manage.
Well said. Dipo, let's talk looted art treasures next, shall we?
Yeah.
1897 is a date when most people in Britain were celebrating Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, and we were presiding over an empire on which the sun famously never set. But it was also the year the people of Benin realized as the start of a war, remember as the start of a war which has never finished. Tell us about this, in particular the Benin bronzes.
Yeah, so in 1897, a group of British troops pillaged what was the Kingdom of Benin then, which was an incredible region in Western Africa that if one of the sort of real joys of writing this book was sort of reading about the kingdom and just how incredible it was and how admired around the world it had been. The walls around the kingdom was sort of considered a great world treasure. Many Portuguese explorers who'd been to the region before sort of write so poetically about this incredible town and kingdom that had incredible the lighting and the way in which the roads had sort of been aligned in this incredible sort of mathematic precision. And that all essentially came to the end by the pillaging of these items and the stealing of what was their cultural treasure, which was then brought to the UK and ended up in museums across the UK and France and Germany, especially, and Belgium, where they remain today. And reading about the pillaging of Benin, and I write about sort of 4 or 5 other similar examples. And what I think really struck me about it was that the taking of the artifacts wasn't a byproduct of war. It wasn't this sort of, oh, they happen to be here, no one's doing anything with them, we should probably take them with us since they're just going to rot here. It was often a stated aim going into the war was to return with these items. And that, for me, sort of created this link between then and now. Often when we talk about the looting, we sort of speak of it as this time that is long past. This happened a long time ago, and it's no longer, this was a different time. And it wasn't in that sense, because often when they went to war, one of the interesting tidbits that I read was that they'd often take with them a curator from the British Museum, whose job it was when all the killing was done was to then go in and take for the British Museum what the British Museum wanted first, and would then leave with those items. And then everyone else could sort of fight over whatever was left. And so it sort of shifts in your brain from this idea of, oh, there was this event that happened a long time ago, and now how do we reckon with that event that happened a long time ago, to this is one big continual event. This was something that started and never ended, the pillaging and taking of these items. And when you also read about how it was spoken about in at that time, there was a similar pillaging in Ethiopia for one of the Magdala treasures. And they were brought to the United Kingdom in 1871. And when they arrived, Prime Minister William Gladstone was furious. He convened Parliament and he gave a speech, and he said that he was personally ashamed that they thought it right for these items to have been stolen from Ethiopia and brought to the UK. And he ordered Lord Napier to ensure that these items were returned immediately. And Napier said, yes, of course, we'll get right to that. And these items are still in the V&A today. And so this is sort of when you start to kind of delve into the actual details and the context of what happened then and what continues to happen now, you start to see it in this incredibly clear picture. But what a lot of museums have done is they've tried to kind of obfuscate, and they've tried to kind of cloud the issue and try and make it seem as if there's something far more complicated about it, because obviously it's in their interest to do so. But in fact, the simple premise of what happened and what continues to happen is very simple. And again, to my frustration, the solution is also fairly simple as well, because no one would suffer from essentially returning the ownership of these items back to these countries, because many of these countries have said they would more than happily lend as many of our artifacts as you need, because we love the idea of our work being celebrated around the world. We would just like some of these artifacts back ourselves. For example, the British Museum is home to about 900 Benin bronzes. About 800 of them are just permanently in storage. They never see the light of day ever. There are only 100 that are ever on display. And the Nigerian government has said, oh, you can keep the 100. That's fine. If you could just give us the 800 back that you don't seem to want to do anything with, we'd really appreciate that. So, it's all these sort of things that unfortunately have sort of clouded the way in which we approach this discussion around the looting of artifacts, and that I hope, this book aims to kind of just simplify it and get us to the point where we come to a solution that would work for everybody happily.
And I think what's particularly interesting about this Benin example is that we have this sort of comforting narrative in the West that colonialism perhaps brought some element of civilization to a sort of benighted land. That's the stereotype, if you like. And actually, this kingdom in Benin was 500 years old. I mean, it was incredibly prosperous. The people didn't even have doors on their houses because it was such a safe place to live. As a Dutch traveller noted, that the walls were so loved, they were polished like mirrors. And as you said, it was this geometrically laid out city. And then the British came along and smashed it all up, basically, and nicked everything.
Yeah.
And, when you realize that narrative, it seems very compelling, that the argument of restitution. But maybe you could, which countries, where is Britain in terms of returning these treasures? Are we ahead or behind of other European countries? What's the discussion? Belgium was in the Congo, France was in the Sahel. Well, how do we compare to what's going on elsewhere?
Britain's probably the furthest behind in terms of these discussions. Germany's the furthest ahead in terms of sort of saying they've begun the process essentially of returning their artifacts slowly. And so they're certainly the furthest ahead. France has sort of promised to do it at a time in the future. So I guess they're in the middle. I'd put them in there. But yeah, the Britain has really sort of dug their heels in when it comes to having this conversation. And as I said, the museums across this country wouldn't suffer by returning the ownership of these items back to these countries, because there are so many of them. When we talk, you sort of from time to time you'll hear a story saying, this museum has returned 4 artifacts back. There are hundreds of thousands of these items abroad. About 90% of all of Africa's cultural material legacy is outside of the continent today. So we're talking of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of items that could fill the British Museum 1 million times over. And so that is sort of one of the truly sort of frustrating things about it, is that there are obvious steps that should be taken to just to address what is this sort of ongoing theft that has continued to today, without us, really suffering sort of at either ends for this better understanding.
Okay, we've got to keep racing on, I'm afraid, but I just wanted to touch on this idea that you devote a whole section of your book to, on white saviors, and this particular stereotype where white people are going to come to the salvation of of starving Africans, which was a kind of stereotype that was particularly prevalent in the 1980s with Bob Geldof and Live Aid and Band Aid. And I just wanted you, when you're shopping in Aldi or Waitrose perhaps, on next Christmas, if this song comes up on the tannoy, do they know it's Christmas? I just want you to remember this conversation, because explain why you have a problem with this.
So there's an interesting thing that happened before colonialism, actually, where a lot of the colonial powers sent explorers into the region, and those explorers came back and they told the colonialists of the day that Africa was an incredible place. They told stories of the Kingdom of Benin, and they spoke of the incredible natural resources and the amazing people who are as technologically advanced as anywhere else in the world. And that was what basically inspired the colonialists to decide that they wanted to go in and take those items. But back in that time, it was illegal to do. And so the colonialists at the Berlin Conference decided that they would create another myth, because to justify the going in and stealing these items. And they would tell the world that Africa was a place of savages and uncivilized people, and who couldn't look after themselves, and that they would introduce to them what they called the 3 Cs, which was commerce, Christianity, and civilization. That was their justification for going in, and that's what they would tell the rest of the world. And that was a myth that spread well into the independence era. And obviously their aim at that time was to take the natural resources and colonize the region. And then that myth sort of found a new home for different reasons. You got sort of the 70s and 80s, and the world had heard about many of the civil wars, and they'd been going on, and they'd heard about the chaos and some of the violence. They'd heard about what was happening, but they didn't hear about the context of why these things were happening. And so this sort of new myth found a new home, where the world was hearing again that Africa was a place full of just poverty and destitution and strife. And one of the sort of most impactful sort of carriers of this message was through popular culture. And the most effective was this song, Do They Know It's Christmas, the Band Aid single that was released in the 80s, of all the greatest pop stars of the day, creating and singing a song that traveled around the world, showing images of destitution, that said that Africa was a place where there was no running water, that Africa was a place where the only hope that Africans can have every year is to stay alive, that there is no joy, and we should think of the others. And it pitted Africans as the others. And the people who created that song genuinely wanted to do good. They didn't have evil intentions. It wasn't the same intentions as the colonialists at the Berlin Conference. But that's what stereotypes do. When you believe them, they find new ways of continuing and being propelled. And so what that did was, you had countries in the 80s and 90s who had been through their civil war era. They had been able to push back against the big men that they'd spoken about. They'd started the process of developing national identities and national traditions. And they started saying to themselves, okay, we've done that work. Now what we want is the rest of the world to come and see us for who we are as individual nations, and come and experience what the work that we have done. That was incredibly difficult to do when the rest of the world was hearing a very different message, that this whole region was under this sort of dark cloud of devastation and poverty and pain and suffering. And so when you're not going to go from hearing that song to going, oh, I would quite like to spend my summer holiday in the Gambia or in Senegal or Morocco, and so that then created this challenge that how do we overcome these images that were, and because of the success of Band Aid, that then led to copycat versions of it that found you could raise a ton of money very quickly by showing certain images, by not getting into the specificity of the particular conflict at the time, but just show images of starving children. If I asked everyone to sort of close their eyes, you can picture these adverts. And again, the people behind these adverts were trying to do good, but they were just doing it in the wrong way, in a way that in some cases in the short term raised a lot of money and put, maybe were able to sort of challenge a particular very specific wrong, but it created this wider problem that a lot of people from across the continent have struggled to, up until today, to push back against. Because if you still ask most people around the world to close their eyes and picture Africa, those are the images they think of. They think of poverty or safari with very little else in between, unless you yourself have been to a particular country. And that's the work of this book and the work of so many people across the continent, is to try and give people more of a feeling of curiosity to understand that these are different countries with different circumstances, and the challenges that need to be faced are different in each region. And so, that really is kind of the legacy of many of these charity campaigns.
Thank you, Dipo. We're out of time, and we haven't even talked about Jollof rice, but there is a few minutes for questions. So, the man at the front in the red trousers, please. Front right. Wait for the microphone. Thank you.
So in mostly the 20th century, when the national borders were being imposed by Western countries, do you think it would have been better if those borders hewed closer to tribal lines?
Yeah, absolutely. The borders are probably one of the most egregious crimes committed against the continent. Most people, if you look at a map of Africa, it's just lots of straight lines. About 10% of all borders are just straight lines. And those borders cut through about 30% of all ethnic groups. And so that was one of the things that created an incredible amount of strife between groups, because not only were you suddenly forced to be a part of a country that you had no interest in being a part of, but your ethnic group had been split between countries. And so it made it incredibly hard for you for either ethnic group on either side to see themselves as part of this central nation. And so if you and that was one of the questions actually after independence, was should we realign these borders? Should we try and draw this all again? And the work of that, they decided, would just be too much. It was the 1960s, the rest of the world was moving on. How many more decades would it take to, first of all, even come up with a realignment? And also there was this idea that many of the bigger countries would have way too much influence on the smaller countries, and they'd have too much to pick and choose. And I talk about that challenge in the book.
Oh, the gentleman at the back there. Thank you.
You mentioned the influence of Russia and the USA in the Cold War. What is your opinion of the current influence of China on Africa?
Yeah. So that is a really interesting question. I think what you have a lot of times now, and what the sort of the different dynamic you have now, is that because you have a lot of African countries that have been able to establish themselves and are on far stronger footing, they are making individual deals with Chinese companies and the Chinese government that they hope. Sorry? So in certain cases, and for example, if they were to, if the Nigerian government, for example, were to make a bad deal with China, that certainly would be the Nigerian government's fault. But in many cases, China really are hoping that at some point in the future, because they can't ask for this money back. They can't invade these countries now. They can't ask for the money back. Many of these countries will never pay them back. What they're hoping for is that should there one day be some kind of conflict between the US, not military conflict, but some sort of conflict between the US and China, that these African countries might decide to stay out of it and not get involved. And so you see some of that dynamic at the moment in some 2 or 3 countries with the current Ukraine and Russia conflict, is that some countries have a bit of a relationship with Russia, so they've decided to stay out of it. So really what China are buying is neutrality in many cases. But it certainly is the responsibility of individual countries now to sign deals that best suit them. You shouldn't be in a position now to get hoodwinked by someone offering to build you some trains.
Okay, more questions. The gentleman on the far left here, please.
Thank you. One comment, one question. I think Paul Kagame, who you've spoken about quite a bit, deserves hero status, because as I understand it, every member of the Rwandan population is required to pick litter once a month, which is something we would do well to emulate, which would be interesting. But the question is about, could you just talk a little bit about Zimbabwe? The big man left, and then there was great hope that when Mnangagwa got in, it was a new era. And that hasn't proven to be the case, from what I understand, that corruption is still as bad as it was and so forth. And just wondered what your comment was on that, and is that partly the fault of the British legacy of the constitution we left behind, or is it something else?
I go into quite a lot of detail about Mugabe's rule and everything that happened before Mugabe came into power, and a lot of kind of the whys and whatnots of what's happening in Zimbabwe. And it continues to be an incredibly complicated region in terms of the legacy of settler rule. We spoke earlier about sort of divide and rule policies, where that often happened in regions in which the British didn't want to live. In the places that they did want to live, that created a whole new dynamic in Zimbabwe and South Africa, in which lots and lots of land was taken. And so you hit independence, you're like, well, what do we do? Because you're a few generations down, the people who own this land are certainly now Zimbabweans, they're now South Africans, they've been here for a long time.
It's like 2% of the population owned more than half the agricultural land in Zimbabwe, and that 2% were white.
And so you have this dynamic in Zimbabwe where you have people who are still, and in South Africa as well, there's sort of this relationship saying, look, there is still this huge disparity between so many people. So how do we deal with this? And so until they come up with some way of addressing how to move forward in a productive way for everyone, then you're still going to have too many sort of hands in the pie trying to steer the president in so many different directions. And that's what Mugabe essentially suffered from, was instead of trying to find a way of moving forward, he and the people that surrounded him were constantly looking backwards and trying to seek vengeance, a vengeance that a lot of people would have seek based on what happened prior to the independence. The Zimbabwe was in a particularly difficult situation with a colonialist who said that for the next 100 years and beyond that, Zimbabwe will forever be a white nation. He was a white supremacist who inspired white supremacists in America, but how brutal he was in that sense. But again, I think Zimbabwe will have to find a way of looking forward. And I think a lot of that, they've spent way too much time trying to seek vengeance and trying to kind of find a way of getting some form of restitution for what happened in the past, which is making it very difficult. And Western countries won't let you do that as well. They will keep punishing you until you move forward. Mandela wasn't a popular man until he said, "I won't seek vengeance. Let's all move forward, peace and reconciliation." Prior to that, he was not globally in many corners seen as a popular person. He was popular in South Africa, obviously, but amongst Black South Africans. But around the world, he wasn't seen as a particularly popular man until he chose peace and reconciliation. And then he became seen globally as this great statesman. If he had decided to go and take that land back, then he would have been considered around the world in the same way as Mugabe is considered today. Which path is best for your nation? There is still great economic disparities in South Africa. It's difficult, it's complicated, but it's a really interesting sort of conversation to be had about the future of many of these countries.
Well, I think that's Mandela is a very fitting way to end. I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm so sorry. But thank you so much, Dipo, for explaining